Chapter 3: A New Gold Strike. Large wagon trains with adequate protection against Indian attack had made the journey from Laramie to the goldfields in Idaho, but those who attempted to slip through in one or two wagons had almost, without exception, left their bones beside the trail. Elliot and Leisha knew the danger, yet they made their preparations with a light-hearted disregard of it. Hadn't they driven one lone wagon from North Platte to Laramie? Lisha had found a little mongrel dog, and it followed him like a shadow. "I don't know about that dog," Elliot said as they got the covered wagon ready for the trip. "We'll be going through a hostile Indian country most of the way, and that dog might bark at the wrong time." Lisha looked down into the trusting brown eyes of his little dog and said, "He goes with me. Crows, Sioux, and Chinese and Cheyenne Indians crossed and recrossed in front and in back of the Ross brothers' lone wagon as it moved slowly westward through South Pass and then north toward the gold fields in what is now western Montana. But as though under a cloak of invisibility or some protective guidance, they crawled along through the wild, barren country, each evening drawing nearer to their objective. Jolting along in the covered wagon with only the gentle sounds of nature and the sight of nature's awakening life to stimulate their senses, Lisha and Elliot began to doubt all the fearful stories they had heard about this trail. Then one morning, when Lisha went out with his dog to look for the oxen, he saw about 15 horsemen approaching. They must be Indians. He concealed himself in a clump of sagebrush. His little dog seemed to sense danger in his master's caution. He crouched at Lisha's side without a whimper. The Indians came straight toward Lisha's hiding place. He knew he hadn't a chance against so many. He had no doubt that within the next few minutes he would be scalped or taken prisoner. His heart pounded so loud that he felt sure the Indians must hear it. The hair bristled on the dog's back, yet he did not bark or utter a sound. The Indians passed within a few yards of Lish's hiding place. Lish crept out, located the oxen, and took them back to the wagon. "What's the matter, Lish? You sick?" Elliot looked at his brother in concern. "Elliot, did you see the Indians?" he asked. "No," Elliot scowled. "I did think I heard the sound of horses' hooves, but I decided it must be my imagination." "Real Indians!" Lish caught his breath and sat down by the wagon. "About 15 of them, and so close I could have hit them with a stone. Well, in a few days we'll be among the settlements in the gold country." Elliot hitched the oxen and climbed to the high seat, and Lisha walked along beside the team as they picked their patient way along the trail through the wild, unsettled land. They had gone a good distance before Lisha could quiet his own rapid heartbeat. Without further incident, and with no molestation by anyone, the Rouse brothers came at last to Deer Lodge and staked out mining claims. Neither of them knew much about gold mining. They had heard stories of free gold coming out of the new strikes in Idaho. They understood that free gold came from placer mining and that no milling process was necessary to free the gold as in the quartz gold mines in Colorado. The boys had no success with their first claim. So they moved on to Hell Gate, near the present city of Missoula, Montana, hoping to find something better. There, Licious saw some of the men preparing fields for planting. He picked out a piece of rich-looking land and sowed it to wheat. Elliot helped, but Lisha could see that Elliot's thoughts and plans lay with adventuring gold seekers. Only one shadow marred Lisha's joy in the wild freedom and vast opportunity of the Northwest. Elliot had started drinking again. He had made friends in Hell Gate who influenced him to hang around the saloons and mix in the vulgar talk. One day, as Lisha stood looking over his growing wheat, he thought with a pang of remorse over the months since he had left home. With sudden insight, he realized how far he and Elliot had drifted from their early training. He could scarcely remember his mother. She had died before he had grown old enough to go to school. But his older sister, Helen, had taken Mother's place and carried on the family devotions. He remembered his mother's Bible. Often, while still a small boy, he had leafed through it, looking at the pictures and reading verses which his mother or his sister Helen had underlined. Now, two verses seemed to stand out clearly in his memory, as though illuminated. Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong. Thine eyes and thine heart are not but for thy covetousness, and for to shed innocent blood, and for oppression, and for violence to do it. Jeremiah 22:13 and 17. He thought of the country, wild and unsettled, that had become his home, and he resolved that he would follow justice and fair play. Much as he wanted a part in the future of the West, he made up his mind that he would never deal dishonestly or take part in the violence around him. He looked at his first crop, and although the urge of the gold fields still drew him, he knew that the trail of gold would always be bloodied with violent acts and plagued with greed and deceit. He watched the gentle undulations of the green wheat and felt comforted. Now reports reached Hell Gate of a new gold strike at Bannock. Elliot and his friends rushed off to stake out claims, but Lisha, jealous for his wheat crop, stayed by his field. He and Elliot had bought the seed that spring for $10 a bushel. Now the price of wheat had dropped. Still, Lisha is expected to get $6 a bushel for his crop. He entered into his harvest with enthusiasm. He worked from dawn till dark. Day by day, he saw the standing wheat, cut with scythes and hand bound in bundles, then stacked in shocks, ready for threshing. Lisha helped his neighbors, and finally, just before snow fell, he saw the last of his grain threshed and sold. One day, Lisha heard a man who had ridden into Hell Gate describe in an exciting voice a latter gold strike that any he had heard about. A man had started to grub out sagebrush for a cabin site, and when he pulled up this here sagebrush, gold nuggets were sticking around among the roots. With such sensational news drawing him, Lisha planned to join his brother in Bannock. A letter had come from Elliot describing the gold camp of Bannock as a friendly place with good neighbors and fine prospects. Lisha took the trail that led south over the pass between Bitterroot Valley and Big Hole Basin and on the grasshopper diggings at Bannock. The winter had been mild and the snow not too deep, and early in January of 1863 Lisha reached Bannock. Somehow the description Elliot had given of a friendly community didn't seem to fit the picture that met Lish's gaze. He felt a particular uneasy worry. He eyed the knots of armed men in the street with suspicion. Lisha rode his horse down the street to the livery stable. "I'm looking for my brother, Elliot Rouse." He slid from his horse and faced the man at the livery stable. "Do you happen to know him?" The man looked at him with sharp interest. "Son," he said, "people in this camp don't tell nobody who they are or what they want unless they're looking for trouble." Alicia stared at the man and said nothing. "Of course, I can see you're new here. Look, kid, you just don't know who you can trust. I want to keep you out of trouble." Alicia decided that he liked this man who was kind enough to give him a word of caution. "I don't know your brother, but I'll help you find him." Alicia followed his new friend to Skinner's saloon. "Any of you fellas know Elliot Rouse?" the man called out. The buzz of conversation ended. "Who's that you're looking for?" a voice inquired. "Elliot Rouse," Alicia spoke up. "Yes, I know him." A man started toward him. Alicia thanked the man from the livery stable and turned to the stranger. "I'm Elliot's brother." "Alicia." He held out his hand. "I'm John Bozeman, and right proud to meet you." He shook Alicia's hand. "Let's have a drink, and I'll take you over to the place where your brother stays." "Thanks, I don't drink." Alicia studied the strong, fine-looking young man. "Don't drink, eh?" Bozeman looked surprised. "Wish I could let the stuff alone." John led Alicia down the main street, and after walking a short distance, he stopped and pointed out the cabin where Elliot lived on the bank of the Grasshopper Creek. Alicia thanked his guide and walked on to the little shack. Elliot Elliot's welcome made up for the disappointment Alicia had begun to feel in Bannock. The brothers talked while Elliot built up a fire to warm Alicia's chilled body and to cook a hot supper. "Everything's changed since I wrote you that letter." Elliot looked more stern and severe than ever. "The gold has brought hundreds of strangers into town, and more come every day." He explained that the gold claims and the work were not plentiful enough to satisfy all the men who had crowded into Bannock. The winter freeze had put a stop to the placer mining. Men milled about the streets with nothing to occupy their minds but liquor and mischief. "Do you see that camp over there?" Elliot pointed to clustered covered wagons. "One day last week, while the campers warmed themselves at an outside fire, one of the town toughs fired a shot right into the midst of them." What excuse could he give for such behavior? He said he thought they were Indians. "I suppose they're immigrants that got here too late to find housing or work." "Correct," Elliot went on. "Of course, there are still good men in the town. Trouble is, you don't know who you can trust." Same words the man at the livery stable had used, Alicia thought. There seems to be a bunch of revolver-toting toughs who are organized and they control the town by a bloody code. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you cross one of them, they will gang up on you. You have to go along with them or they mark you for murder," Elliot explained. "If you want to save your hide, stay away from Skinner's saloon. That's where the toughs hang out." Alicia wondered if Elliot had decided to stay away from the saloon. He hoped so. His mind went to John Bozeman, the man he had met in Skinner's saloon, and who had directed him to Elliot's cabin. "What about that fellow, Bozeman?" Bozeman's all right. I think the only reason he goes to the saloon is because he's from Georgia, and most of the fellas that hang out there are Confederates or Confederate sympathizers, Elliot continued. Of course, their gang rule isn't confined to Skinner's saloon. They have the upper hands in Bannock now. Lisha had worked with tough men here in the West, but nothing had prepared him for the violence he found in Bannock. The wild, ungoverned lives of the miners, gamblers, ruffians, horse thieves, and robbers shocked him. Before he had been in town many days, he saw two young men ride away from Skinner's saloon in a state of drunken frenzy. They began firing into one of the lodges in the Indian camp, only a short distance from Yankee Flat, which lay across Grasshopper Creek and east of Elliot's cabin. They returned to the saloon for a few more drinks and reinforcements. Then they returned to the Indian camp to finish the job. They poured volley after volley into the Indian lodge with deadly effect. An Indian chief fell. So did a Frenchman who had come out to see what the shooting was all about. A lame boy and a papoose were also carried out dead. The miners became so enraged over this atrocity that they convened a miners' court, arrested the criminals, and tried them. Lisha expected the young desperadoes to hang for their crimes, but the jury, intimidated by the gang, failed to ask for the death penalty and banished the offenders from the town instead. Throughout the rest of the winter, Lisha saw people killed almost daily with guns and knives. Some good things happened in Bannock during those months. One of the best was the coming of Sidney Egerton. He had been elected to Congress in 1858. Now, in 1863, he had accepted an appointment as Chief Justice of the newly organized Idaho Territory. On his way to Lewiston, he stopped at Bannock and found tremendous agitation for a division of the huge Idaho Territory. Idaho Territory at the time included what now makes up the states of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and the western parts of North and South Dakota. The Sunday after Egerton's arrival, Elliot and Lisha heard an orator climb into a covered wagon and deliver a most persuasive plea for a split of the vast Idaho Territory. They could see that Judge Egerton was much affected. Citizens of Bannock and surrounding settlements met and chose Judge Egerton to act as their agent in Washington, D.C., to secure a division of the territory. I shouldn't wonder if he gets it, Elliot said as the judge had left for the east. I think he will too. Did you see the gold buttons that Mrs. Egerton sewed onto the judge's coat? They couldn't help being convinced, those men in Washington. At least they will realize that Bannock is an important place. The Civil War makes gold important right now, I suppose, Elliot said. A year later, Judge Egerton came back from Washington with the good news that Idaho Territory had been divided. The eastern portion would be known as Montana Territory. On his way back, the judge was notified of his appointment as the first governor of the new territory. Bannock became the first capital. Meanwhile, two other persons rode into Bannock during the winter of 1862 to 1863. A man named Henry Plummer and his friend Jack Cleveland. Within a month, the two quarreled and Plummer shot and killed his partner. He successfully pled self-defense, but the sheriff, Hank Crawford, had carried the dying Cleveland into his room to care for him in his own bed. Plummer had no way of knowing what Cleveland had said to the sheriff. You know, Plummer is trying to draw the sheriff into a gunfight, Elliot told Lisha one evening. He's afraid Hank knows too much. He's afraid Cleveland may have talked before he died. Well, I think Hank's too smart for him, even if Plummer is the fastest gun in the West, Lisha said with admiration. A day or so later, Lisha saw Plummer hanging around the sheriff's meat market. Lisha felt sure that he hoped to catch the sheriff and shoot him. But then he saw the sheriff had foiled Henry Plummer again. He had taken up a position across the street, and taking deliberate aim, he shot Plummer in the right arm, thus ruining his marksmanship for a few weeks, or until he learned to shoot with his left hand. Why don't people stand up for the sheriff? Lisha asked in disgust when he told Elliot about it. They're too scared for their own lives, I suppose. Correct, Elliot said. Hank could have killed Plummer as easily as he shot him in the arm. The sheriff wants peace and order. He doesn't want to kill people. During the next few days, the whole band of ruffians turned on the sheriff and made several attempts to kill him. When he fled for his life, they made Henry Plummer sheriff of Bannock.